Good evening, friends and strangers. My name is Teacher on the Radio, and this is another edition of the Music Nerds Record Club, number 8. We are a group of friends that love music. We also include folks that work in music in some form or another. We have Scott Greenberg, host of the That's No Honest Man Can Pay, Amy Rock, blogger and superfan out of Nashville, Tennessee, Joe from near New York City. We have Gus, the music critic for the Tennessee Tech Oracle newspaper. And I double as a DJ on the college station. And we're about to celebrate 17 years of the show on the air. I think That's No Honest Man Can Pay has been on the show even longer. The way this works is each month, one of us picks an iconic album, iconic to us, shares it with everyone else. We listen to it. Then we get together and we talk about it. And that's the first half hour of the show. And the second half hour of this episode, we just share some of our recent listening joys. And in absentia tonight is Rick, who is a sometimes music critic over at the website popmatters.com. I know he's working on a Nick Cave review as we speak. I don't think I have his second half hour notes, but I do have his comments on the album of the night. And Scott Greenberg is going to get us started and share with us his take on Cure for Pain by Morphine on this edition of the Music Nerds Record Club.
Hey, everybody. It's Greenberg here from the That's No Honest Man Can Pay podcast. And I have some remarks I've prepared for which I'm going to put on the readers. So bear with me. With all due respect to the Titans of the Pacific Northwest, my favorite band of the 90s is a guitarless trio from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Make no mistake, I like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam just fine. But they just don't speak to where I was in the 90s. Sure, I felt isolated, weird, awkward, and didn't know where the hell I fit in. But not in a Seattle way. Was a couple years out of college, realized upon impact of graduation that my plans A and B were shit, and spent the better part of the decade trying to get my plan C to pop into an actual career. Even more disastrous were my attempts at dating, but that's another story for another time. Having to hold down 2 jobs to make ends meet meant that my social life was sporadic at best. Depression and anxiety were with me every step of the way. I just didn't know them by name at the time. The 90s as a decade felt mean to me. Not viciously mean, but the rude, dickish kind of too cool to care mean that made me want to slap the taste out of the 90s mouth. More than ever, I felt like I was on the outside looking in. Seattle loud brought me no solace in the 90s. Not that there's a damn thing wrong with Seattle loud. It just didn't speak to me on a personal level. What I needed wasn't loud. What I needed was not angsty. What I needed was dark and moody. But not goth dark and moody. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Loves me some dark wave, especially around Halloween. And while the darkness on the edge of town has been a faithful traveling companion to me, the darkness I craved in the 90s was something I would later refer to as smoky noir cool. All one word, lowercase. No hyphens. What I needed was Morphine. The band, not the drug. Morphine first popped up on my radar in 1993 with the release of their second album, Cure for Pain, when they were in heavy rotation on Detroit NPR affiliate WDET. Buena erupted from my crappy little desk speakers at my more than tolerable day job with the kind of low-end rumble that spoke to me on a million levels. Morphine had more swagger than a wheat field full of 6-string cock rock gunslingers, and they did it all without guitars. Bass, sax, drums, vocals. The recipe was bare bones simple, but there was nothing simplistic about Morphine. Mark Sandman played a 2-string bass. a 2-string slide bass. Dana Colley played a baritone sax. Drummer Jerome Dupree tied it all together on the record with versatility and aplomb. However, it was Billy Conway who I would see play live with Morphine twice. On top of it all was Mark Sandman's smoky voice, regaling us with tales of likable chumps who either couldn't catch a break with the best Mitt Rawlings had to offer, or just couldn't get out of their own damn way. Both times I'd seen Morphine were at Detroit's legendary St. Andrews Hall. The first Morphine show I saw would later be immortalized 7 years later on the album Bootleg Detroit. The second Morphine show I saw featured Medeski, Martin, and Wood as the opening act. In interviews, Sandman spoke at great length about how Morphine are practitioners of something he calls low rock. However, Morphine was not Sandman and Colley's first foray into that genre. Both of them were members of the 80s band Treat Her Right, and while their songs also played like film noir vignettes, the sound palette was different, with Sandman on quote-unquote low guitar and Conway on a cocktail drum kit alongside guitarist David Champagne and Jim Fitting on harmonica. Morphine had it all: undeniable grooves, low-key cinematic flair, and an irresistible cast of characters. When Mark Sandman sings "I'm Yours to Command" on Sheila, I'm right there with him, regardless of how much trouble she may or may not be. When the protagonist of Thursday tells us we used to meet every Thursday in the afternoon for a couple of beers and a game of pool, I knew it didn't end there. Half of me wants to yell at the screen, "Get the hell out of there!" And the other half of me is content to live vicariously through his exploits. When he sings, "I got guilt, I got fear, I got regret. I'm just a panic-stricken waste. I'm such a jerk," he's never been more relatable. And when he sings of having a head with wings, I'm not 100% certain I know what the hell he's talking about or what drugs he may or may not be on, but one thing's for damn sure: I'll have what he's having. When I knew it was my turn to pick the album, I knew I was going to pick a Morphine record. But would it be Cure for Pain or the 1995 follow-up Yes? Ultimately, I had to go with the conventional wisdom that you always go with the one who brought you to the dance. And for me, that's Cure for Pain. Mark Sandman died on July 3rd, 1999, of a heart attack on stage at a festival in Italy. They were only 8 songs into the set when he shuffled off of this mortal coil in the middle of a song called Super Sex. His passing, not unlike that of Joe Strummer, still stings. Still, he went out in the most Mark Sandman way possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you this month's album, Cure for Pain by Morphine. Let the games begin.
That was so beautiful. Thank you. I love the comparison between Seattle grunge loud and smoky noir cool. When I got into music, I was all about the Seattle grunge loud, but this album is so my thing in that smoky noir cool thing. It's 100% bass grooves, 100% moody baritone vocals, and 100% the most random and unnecessary instrument to include in your alt-rock band, saxophone. Let's go. I love it for not being like anything else. It's unapologetically its own thing. It's weird. It reminds me of my teenage CD collection. When I was in high school in the aughts, one of my hobbies was going to McKay's in Chattanooga. I would spend hours digging through the bargain and scratched bins and go home with a stack of CDs for like $10. And it was great. I was allergic to anything popular or trendy, so I'd search for the most weird and unique CDs I could find. Sure, I'd snag a slightly scratched album from a band I knew, but the real treasures were the CDs that briefly passed through a radio station. You could spot them by the notch in the spine, of the jewel case or the hole punched through the barcode to indicate that it wasn't meant for resale. For me, the more random, the better. Sometimes it was a tiny self-published band, super local to wherever they were from, and it was usually subjectively bad, but the art or the band name was interesting, compelling, and weird. But the best ones were the CDs that bore the logo of some long-forgotten major label subsidiary from a band that never quite made it into the mainstream consciousness beyond maybe a 90s alternative radio hit that I wasn't around to be listening to. So I'm thinking Dishwaller, Possum Dixon. Let's see. I have Granddaddy. There's Possum Dixon. This is one of the bad ones. Plan B. It's weird. It's kind of electronic. And the Reunion Show, like Poppy and Good. So I just wanted to share a bit of my collection because this album kind of reminds me of what I would have found and what I would have really connected to them. It fits in that category super easily. I'd like to imagine that this album passed through my hands while I was digging through McKay's, and just because of the pure stochastic nature of the universe, it didn't come home with me. I would have felt thrilled and scandalized seeing the band name shares the name of a drug, and I would have looked in the liner notes and saw that it had saxophone and bass, and I would have put it into my CD booklet that I kept in my car, and my poor friends would have to choose from these unknown bands to them while riding with me on the way to Steak and Shake from high school. This month, while I was listening to this album, I didn't even make time to really dig into the lyrics of this album because it doesn't really feel like the purpose of this kind of music. To use an expression I tend to overuse, it's about the vibe. And I understand why Scott struggled to pick which album to do, because after I listened to this one, I just put on the next one and just continued listening to the band. I wanted more, and it was a joy to find out that there was more and it was ready to stream. Really, I wish I could go back in time and give myself this CD so I could fall in love with it and be super annoying about it. I love it now. I'm falling in love so hard, but I'm just so nostalgic for that feeling of finding a new band and none of your friends have heard about it and you love it so selfishly and you share it so passionately. Just the feeling of a heavy jewel case from a CD that was manufactured in the early 90s, maybe with a jagged notch on the spine to remind me that I was holding something that couldn't be bought.
I'm so grateful to Scott and Amy and for the amount of time and love that my fellow music nerds put into making this live stream every month so meaningful. I am not going to be Andrew or Teacher on the Radio or even Sunfrog. I'm going to stand in for Rick and share some of his thoughts because he could not be with us tonight. One of the joys of this monthly online collaboration for me is discovering albums and artists I missed along the way, and with the help of a trustworthy guide like Scott, making up for lost time and experiencing the first joy of discovery, even 3 decades removed from the release. The 90s were mostly a musical black hole for me. I was in the waning days of grad school. My commutes to and from work were filled with sports talk radio, a bad habit I finally kicked several years ago. The stereo was now integrated into a home entertainment system, effectively meaning that the television and DVD player ruled the shared space. Our first little one arrived in 92, followed by his sister in 97, so family car excursions included Aladdin soundtracks and Radio Disney. I missed a lot of the popular culture pulse. Sure, I knew about grunge and everyone heard of Nirvana, but my familiarity at the time didn't extend past Smells Like Teen Spirit. I even avoided my ride or die band U2 90s classics until almost the aughts. It's a musical desert when I look back. Also, I'm interested in what my first impressions of a band are from their name before I've even listened to their music. When Scott suggested Morphine, I will admit I had an impression of perhaps metal, darkness, or druggy brooding. What I did not have on my list was a funky baritone saxophone and a bluesy jazz bass line driving the stellar record. What a joyous surprise to my ears and an underscoring of why one can't judge a book solely by its cover. The title song is a jazzy bop that tips a hat to the early rock and roll ensembles and their hooks, all the while channeling perfectly the tenuous relation between uncertainty and doubt with cautious optimism that was such a part of the 90s zeitgeist. There are sprinklings of funk and jazz fusion, along with doses of the E Street Band's grooviness interpolated for a new decade. One of my favorites in the multiple listens over the weekend was All Wrong, which starts out like the theme to the coolest late night show you haven't yet seen. The sensual interplay between the sax and rhythm section drive this infectious song, along with the subdued vocals that keep it grounded. I was truly surprised and pleased by the Frampton-esque guitar effects. Sold. I love the closing nod to classic bop and the genius of Miles Davis in the track Miles Davis's Funeral. In short, I enjoyed this album immensely, and I'm excited about a new place to dive deep into things I missed the first time around. I'm also grateful to Scott for helping me to have a new and better association of the 90s and the saxophone outside of Bill Clinton and Arsenio Hall. He actually does have notes for the next half hour, so he will get his spot in the next half hour. And now I'm going to bring up the youngest member of the Music Nerds from here in Cookeville, Gus. Gus, are you there? Oh,
I'm here. Hi. Well, like most of the, or at least a few of the albums we've done so far in this series, this is one I was not familiar with. I had heard of the band. I'd heard of Morphine, and I ended up talking to my dad about it a little bit, and I got some more context on like the role it's sort of played in the background of my life. It's they're a band my dad has used for quite a few shows, used their music. And yeah, so I don't have a ton to say beyond that. I really loved it. I mean, it was so much fun to get into. It's so different from basically everything I've ever listened to. I think that the combination of the saxophone and that incredible bass together just makes the whole dark environment really really clear, and it accentuates the themes of different vices being used as a cure for pain throughout the album. It's insanely groovy and infectious, and it's such an interesting way to do like an alternative music with a little bit of grunge and a whole lot of jazz and fantastic vocal performances throughout the whole thing. I loved it. It was dark, and it felt like sensual, and yeah, I mean, from start to finish, it's like the kind of album, one of those albums that I never really knew I wanted until I heard it. I like my favorite songs that I've gone back to the most, because I've been listening to it pretty consistently the past couple of weeks to get ready, and you can still see how unprepared I am, because it's a hard one for me to describe. But yeah, I'm Free Now is beautiful. I love the harmonies and All Wrong in the chorus. It's probably my favorite chorus on the record. Thursday is like, I love how Scott talked about Thursday. That's a powerful song. I love the writing throughout this whole thing. And yeah, I mean, I was so into this album that I haven't gotten to expand into other Morphine records, but I look forward to it. It's definitely going to be in my near future. And yeah, again, I don't have a ton to say on this, other than the fact that I'm really grateful that it was brought in for this for this month. It's a record that definitely enticed me quite a bit, and I look forward to seeing what else is in the Morphine catalog and how it hits me. Yeah, I'm didn't have a ton to say about this one. I was honestly really just excited to hear what everyone else has to say. It's a little outside of my regular comfort zone, which I'm so glad that I got to get out of. But yeah, I'm gonna pass it on. But yeah, I just, again, I'm really grateful that this was the record chosen. It was so much fun to get to explore it. And I bet if I had another week, I'd probably have something a little more well put together. But for now, I'm just still enamored by the sound palettes on here, and look forward to continuing to return and see what else is waiting in the catalog for me.
Joe, you need to unmute yourself.
All right. Hello. Hi. Thank you, Gus, and everybody else, and Scott. I've been wondering how you'd approach that, and you took a great angle. That was a great way to talk about the album. Which, you know, I have a very sort of personal relationship with this one too, probably dwelling on a lot of the same unnamed emotions that I was coping with at the time. I was living in Chicago, and my stay was bookended by the release of Cure for Pain and Yes, which are really hard to separate in my mind. And they were one of the soundtracks of my time there, along with Nirvana. I like both of those for wildly different reasons. And I did see Nirvana. Unfortunately, I never did see Morphine. I love, like everybody else, I love that baritone sax. I don't know what it is about baritone sax. It hits a special, almost a special emotional spot for me. It's just got a real power in that sound that the other saxophones don't have. He scrunks that thing, whether it's orgasmically or angrily, in all the right places. And it's just something that really set that apart. There wasn't really anybody doing saxophones, even though, so many of those bands of that time were sort of drawing on this crazed saxophone inspired sound that like the Stooges or who am I thinking of? The MC5 had, and the Stooges did have a saxophone for a while, so it was always sort of a punky instrument. Anyway, I digress. Scott, you said this was dark and moody, and that's come up a lot. I also think that Mark Sandman wrote some pretty comic lyrics. There's that whole menace in the song Thursday, but it's also, ridiculous. These characters are sad sacks. They don't quite know it yet, and they get themselves into some pretty comic or antic situations that he manages as a writer to thread this line brilliantly, but with this darkness, and there's an underlying or overtone of just sort of cosmic humor in all of it. Scott, you also really shed a new light on those lyrics, which I hadn't paid close attention for, because the music packed such power. It's he was quite an apt at setting a scene, definitely. And yes. You mentioned the 2-string bass that he invented. I was looking stuff up. I thought it had a particular name, but it doesn't. But he also invented something that did have a name, a tritar, which was a combination of 2 of the guitar strings and 1 bass string. So a 3-string bass guitar hybrid. Yeah, that's what I got. I love the album. It's been a part of my life for a lot of years. And I was glad to revisit it, though it hadn't been that long ago. It's never been far from the rotation for me. Thanks for picking it.
So the most profound thing I had to say about this record initially was, wow, saxophone. And everybody who has talked so far has talked about the saxophone. And why is it that saxophone is so iconic and so impactful for us as we're experiencing this band? In part because and I'm glad that Rick mentioned the E Street Band, but in part because our tutelage under punk and even the back to basics rock movement that REM and U2 were about was initially on this idea of guitar, bass, and drums, power trios, and all of that. So certainly this, but I started to do some reading. I'm trying to piece together what's happening with the band. And I really do appreciate where Scott Greenberg went with the emotional architecture of it for him personally and what he was going through at the time. But one of the references that the critics seem to be linking was the literature movement of the Beat Generation. And so primarily those were the writers such as Jack Kerouac, Gary Snyder, Neil Cassidy, William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and the like. And as some of you may remember, or I've told you before, I went in the 90s on a pilgrimage to Boulder, Colorado, to the Jack Kerouac school that was nestled in a Buddhist college there. And I immersed myself fully in the Beat movement in literature and became quite a devotee. And so after I'd listened to the album twice and was mulling around my thoughts and started reading some reviews and kept seeing, that this band was considered to be like a beat movement band, and keeping in mind how close in proximity the early 90s were closer to the 50s, 60s movement than we are to the early 90s, or about the same distance, I guess you could say. The 90s were the same distance from the 90s now as the 90s were from those other movements. And so after I'd kind of, folded my thing up, and I think felt a little bit like Gus did, which was like, wow, cool, thanks. I don't know what else to say because this is just so outside of what I've been indulging, which most of you all know is folk and Americana for the most part. But I got fixated on this beat thing, and it's a very beat way to die, performing live on stage, just for the record here, folks. And I said, I've heard Sandman's voice before. I know that voice. Why do I know that voice? And initially I thought I knew who Morphine was, but it's so many times a person will name a band and I'll just in my name conjure up an image. And I conjured up an image because they were called Morphine, which made me think of other bands like Pavement, for example, just like that one word 90s band. It's like I had this sort of idea in my head, kind of like what Rick said, that had nothing to actually do with the actual experience. But after listening to the record, I remembered that I did remember Sandman's voice. And if I can, I'm going to try to show you this album cover because it is so important to this idea of the band being linked in some way, either whether as just a metaphor or in kind of like as an emotional affinity, or maybe more literally considered to be part of the Beat Generation, because the Beat Generation continues today as a movement that adopts some of the values of spontaneity and wisdom traditions, and maybe excess and indulgence as well as the Beats were known to. So I remembered later that I had this album, and I did have this in a jewel case on CD, Amy Rock, called Kerouac, Kicks Joy Darkness. And it was a compilation album of mostly 90s bands kind of paying homage to the Beat movement. And I wore this thing out when I first got it. Well, the opening track, which I probably put on 1,000 mixtapes back in the day, was simply called Kerouac. And it was basically, it was Morphine, and it was basically Sandman basically chanting Jack Kerouac's name, just basically going Kerouac, Kerouac, Kerouac. And I was like, of course I know this band because I knew that song. I know that song like it lives inside of me. And so I was actually quite more familiar with Morphine than I realized. So it goes. But I love how this group can kind of jog a memory, because I had not thought about this album in quite a long time. But if I went to listen to it now, I would remember all the songs because I had the CD and I wore it out. And that wants me to loop back because I'm going to segue. I'm the first person to go on my recommendations. So as I segue into the second half of the show to talk about what I've been listening to recently, I just want to talk about what Rick was talking about, the 90s being a black hole. He was going to grad school. He was raising a family. I was also going to grad school, raising a family, also traveling a lot, also moving to Tennessee, also being broke as a joke, also having only pretty much the radio, but not having good radio reception, not having found a lot of the good stations. I think I did maybe come across WRVU, the college station in Nashville around that time, but I had to be in Nashville to listen to WRVU. So I had very limited access. This is before streaming. This was before downloading even was a thing. And we had the internet, but we had dial-up. So I wasn't getting music off the internet, and I didn't have a budget for CDs for a lot of the 90s. So I was largely relying on things that people recommended to me, and things I could tape off of my friends' CDs. And it was enough for me just to keep up with REM's latest catalog just by taping the 90s REM albums off my brother, so I could at least know what REM was up to in the 90s. And I did follow the U2 apparently a little bit more than Rick did in the 90s. But again, it was like I might have bought those on CD with what little cash that I had. So as is Music Nerds tradition, I draw the order, the speaking order out of a hat, so it kind of shuffles the deck every episode. And in the second half an hour, after that beautiful discussion of Morphine's Cure for Pain, we will now launch into our current listening. And I'm just going to go through some things, and I know some of this will be repeated in the future people talking. So at the tail end of our last episode, we were just getting word of the No Name album by Jack White. Well, I went and just wore that thing out, listened to it a whole bunch of times, and then got to see Jack White at one of his pop-up shows. And if you've seen now, he's announced that his tour is going to be entirely made of festivals and pop-up shows. And he doesn't want to call them a pop-up show. He just wants to call them a show. But they're going to be gigs in small venues, announced within a couple of days of the actual show. And he's got some coming up in small clubs in DC here in a couple of days. He's playing in Hamtramck on Labor Day at a Labor Day festival for free in Hamtramck with the Henchmen, which was one of his early bands. So he's playing a free show in Hamtramck on actual Labor Day. He just announced a Memphis festival gig in October. Anyway, keep your eye on his Instagram. He seems to be announcing most of this on Instagram. I follow the My Morning Jacket fan group online, and people were talking about the Future Birds. And this was another group where I thought I knew who the Future Birds were, but I didn't. And they live in that same netherworld between indie, folk Americana, and jam band that the Jacket sort of occupies. And they're a band originally out of Athens, Georgia. They have a new album called Easy Company. And I've also indulged all of the Future Birds old records and went to see them live at the Ryman on a whim. It was incredibly invigorating. I got into last year's record by the Heavy Heavy. They've got a new album coming out. They're young people from the south of England. They live like on the beach at the south of England. But their music sounds like the Bay Area. They sound like Jefferson Airplane and the like. They're so very much in that kind of retro 60s soul rock vibe. They're called the Heavy Heavy. Susto, who's out of South Carolina, put out a live album called Live from Codfish Hollow, which is actually quite excellent. If you like kind of soulful crooner type stuff, if you like Van Morrison's music, but you don't like Van Morrison as a person, may I recommend to you the new Ray LaMontagne album called Long Way Home. Also, old alternative radio area, Amos Lee has a new record out that's pretty good. I've recently gotten really into the Red Clay Strays, and they're kind of in that Nathaniel Ratliff-ish kind of, they've got kind of like a Memphis, Muscle Shoals kind of soul meets country kind of sound. Red Clay Strays are quite excellent. Somebody else besides me is probably going to mention the new Gillian Welch and David Rawlings album. But the one that I'm really the most excited about is the new album by Pony Bradshaw called Thus Spoke the Fool. Pony Bradshaw, after being pretty itinerant growing up, settled for his adulthood in North Georgia. And he's written kind of an Appalachian world-building mythos around the mountains of North Georgia and around really invented characters that live in the mountains of North Georgia. And he has a trilogy of kind of literary folk Americana songs centered in North Georgia. The first one was Calico Jim that came out in 2021. In 2023, he released the North Georgia Rounder. And the third of the trilogy is called Thus Spoke the Fool. And that's out just a few days ago. Joe's going to like this, and will be my last tip. Richmond Fontaine from the early Zeros is a very literary Americana group. but they're from the West Coast. They're from the Northwest. But the main guy is a novelist, and I'm going to have to look up the name. I should have Willie Vavlautin. I'm not even sure if I'm saying this right. He has a new novel called Horse, but he's written like 4 kind of gritty, gritlit novels. And so I love that crossover between literature and popular music. And I have now taken up all of my time. I'll come back. Oh, Rick, I looked at the order. I'm also supposed to tell you Rick's Rex. I'm going to tell you Rick's Rex, and then I'm going to pass the torch. He is really into No Name by Jack White. He said, Andy, we'll also talk about No Name by Jack White, but it is killer. Dive into the religious symbolism and quirky lyrics, or just rip the knobs off your system. Either way, this album is stellar. Woodland by Gillian Welch and David Rawlings. I also mentioned that. Americana can be hard to define, but this is it in its purest distillation by its 2 stellar talents. Rawlings' guitar work is virtuosic, and Welch is an iconic voice. Together, they are telling stories of longing, renewal, persistence like few others. Short and Sweet by Sabrina Carpenter. My daughter suggested I give this a listen, and I'm glad I did. Scott Greenberg said in a previous episode that we were in a renaissance of pop. Carpenter's album helps to shore up this case. Wild God by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds releases this Friday, and I'm working on finishing a review. I'll say this. One of my favorite groups has been promising songs of ascent. Meanwhile, Nick Cave and Bad Seeds delivered that ascension. Stream by whatever. Immerse yourself and let it wash over you. Rick is absolutely gonzo over the new Nick Cave, and hopefully he'll be able to publish his review by the end of the week on Pop Matters, when I'm sure we'll share it in our regular group chat. And now I'm going to tip for recent listening to Amy Rock.
That's me. Oh, I'm excited to share my recommendations. My music highlight from this last month was getting to go to Deep Tropics Festival. It's held here in Nashville. It's all EDM and dance music. There's the larger amphitheater stage that faces the Capitol building of downtown Nashville, and they have it all set up so beautifully. There's pyrotechnics and just great vibes. It's a lot of like house and trance music where it's just like super vibey, super chill vibe. The second stage has like harder EDM stuff, bass and I don't know, stuff that makes you want to headbang and the wooks come out. And I spent most of the weekend hanging out at the big stage. It was so hot, so I didn't get to get out there until it was like 6 p.m. So I missed a lot of good stuff, but I got to see some all-time favorites, DJs like Marsh and Elderbrook that have been on the Anjuna Beats label that is my whole life. I love them. And they played some amazing tracks that I was so excited to see. Cascade was the headline on the first night, and he brought a really fun set, brought a lot of more housey and chill stuff compared to his normal songs that he's written, and actually played a lot of the tracks from the new John Summit album that I told y'all about last month. The headline on the second night, their set was cut a little short because one of those Tennessee summer storms popped up, and we pushed it to the last minute. We got soaking wet running to the car, but got to see Sophie Tucker, and their new album just dropped. It's called Bread. We listened to it in the car today coming back from the beach, and it's really cool. Sophie Tucker is one of those maybe guilty pleasure bands for me where it's maybe not cool to like them, but they're popular, cool. But it's dancing, it's fun, it's party music, and I think it's good and fun. So Sophie Tucker, Deep Tropics was great. Let's see. Here's the artist and album that I'm really excited to share with you guys because I don't think y'all have heard of this. It came to my attention through a comedy podcast because Allie Gertz is a musician, but she's also a humorist and comedian. And I just have one question for you. Do you love Nine Inch Nails, but wish it sounded more like down-tempo and lounge music and a female singing the horny, horny Nine Inch Nails songs? Yes. Allie Gertz listened to Nine Inch Nails and fell in love with them and decided that she would make a cover album and play exclusively Nine Inch Nails songs in her style, totally straight, and it's beautiful, and she just kills these songs. It's so listenable and beautiful. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a comedy album. Like, the point is like, what? And it's hilarious and ridiculous, but also it's so good. So please check out Allie Gertz. The album is called Peeled Back, and it's Allie Gertz doing her take on Nine Inch Nails. The other album I'm super stoked on is the new album from Fontaines DC. It's called Romance. The singles off of it have been nonstop on my playlists since they came out. I've been looking forward to this album since, I guess, the end of 2022. Their last album was on my top 10 list. And they're just so fun, so punk rock. I can't wait to spend more time with the new Fontaines DC album, Romance. And the last thing I'll shout out is with my monthly shout out to WNXP, always bringing me great new songs. They played the single off Brijean's new album. I think I'm saying that right. It's Brijean. And she's been in a couple of bands. She's been around. She's expert in percussion, and it's groovy and cool. The lyrics are kind of simple, but they're about trying to make it in the modern world, and it just really hits for me. So Brijean, the new album she has is called Macro. And that's it for me.
All right. Well, I'm going to start off by just seconding the love for Romance by Fontaines DC. The new album just came out. It's awesome. I loved their last record, so I was very excited about this one. I saw I was getting some real positive buzz. And I love it. I mean, the energy's there. It's like a bit of a more polished version of what they've been doing, but while never sacrificing any of what has made them so special. That's a great new album. Another new album that I'm really, really loving and really would recommend to everybody is the new Magdalena Bay. It's called Imaginal Disc. It's the follow-up. They've had some small, like, different odd records in between, but it's really the follow-up to Mercurial Worlds, one of their 2021 album, I believe. It's beautiful, expansive, forward-thinking pop music, and it may make my top 10 at the end of the year. It's a really, really great album. I've also been listening to to a good amount of Gary Bartz. He's a saxophone player who's still making music. He had an excellent Tiny Desk not too long ago. He used to play with Miles Davis. I think that's how I heard about him when I was starting to get a little bit more into that world. And his album, I've Known Rivers and Other Bodies, it has his incredible I've Known Rivers based off of Langston Hughes' poem of a similar name. And it's beautiful. I really love that album. Just listened to it last night again. Also, I recently picked up one of my personal favorite albums ever, Loveless by My Bloody Valentine over at Grimey's. And I've been spinning that and just having so much fun going back to that. It's like every time I listen to it, I have a new favorite song. I guess closing it out, a couple weeks ago, I bought a ticket to go see Anderson .Paak and the Free Nationals for his Malibu tour in Atlanta in October. So I've been listening back through that album Malibu, which is just it's aging so well. It's fantastic, as well as probably my favorite record from him, Ventura, which 2019 it released, and he's like an amalgamation of hip hop and funk and soul and R&B, and it leans more into the R&B soul funk world of it, and it is just fantastic. It's one of my favorite albums of the last, I guess, technically still 5 years. It's one that's always stuck with me. And then I guess the last thing that I want to shout out is it is just a song that is very different from everything that we've talked about in this show, probably ever. It's from the New York rapper. He's from Rochester, New York, RXK Nephew. And it is called American Terrorist, with 2 T's at the beginning and 2 T's at the end. And it is about 10 minutes long and starts off as just not even I guess a critique, but even just his own personal acknowledgments regarding religion and his own socioeconomic place. And it's crazy. It's awesome. It has the beat is good enough that I don't really need to say anything about it because it's not about the production of that song, but it's like a real showing of like partial, I guess, sort of our failed education system. The fact that this man does not have a psychology degree, just some of the ways that he thinks about things, is able to say them so stream of consciousness while making it very understandable and very human. And again, it's a 10-minute song, and I've probably listened to it 20 times in the last 2 weeks. Like it just has my full attention. It's had my brain on lock since I first heard it. It came out in 2021, I believe. But yeah, I definitely wonder how you all would feel about it. But it's one of my favorite songs right now. I think it's one of the most interesting pieces of music I have heard in a very long time. And yeah, I love it. And that's mostly what I've been listening to in the past month. It's been a pretty light month, but it's closing out summer. But it's been very nice. I've loved all of this that I've recommended. So I definitely think it's worth checking out.
Well, heck. What have I been listening to of late? I spent a lot of the months with the chills. Of course, Martin Phillips passed away. We discussed that. Thank you, Scott, for cluing me in on the documentary about Martin Phillips. He had just a really sad life for somebody, for anybody, but he wrote such brilliant music you might not even know unless he paid some real close attention to what he was writing. The one I kind of love the most at the moment is Brave Words Spoken Bravely, which was when he got to give that album a mix. Originally it was such a mess that it sort of buried the music, which was brilliant, but he got a second go at it. Instead of just remastering it, he went through it all and got it the way he thought it should have been then. Another old time band we've been talking about is X. Love, Smoke, and Fiction. It's was like delightfully shocking that they could put out an album so good when it may as well just be a victory lap. John Doe and Exene Cervenka's voices work together as well. They've been lovers and friends forever, mostly friends at this point, and they just have this sort of relationship that comes out in the music. It's really unusual, just a sort of maturity and deep, abiding love that transcends all the other crap I think they probably gave each other. Scott turned me on to Steve Gunn, and he has a new 20-minute single that's pretty much all guitar noodling and strange feedbacky sort of loops, and I love it. I don't know why it sounded so good in the car just driving along. I've sort of had a little fling with REM's Monster, and this goes back to talking about Andy mentioned how 90s U2 was kind of a wasteland. The 90s REM, not a wasteland. He started drifting away from it, and that's kind of interesting because I started drifting away from REM, and each album I embraced a lot less until eventually I stopped reaching for them at all. And now I've sort of come back around on them for the umpteenth time, and Monster is the one I'm really digging. Just that guitar sound is so brash for a band that had gotten so big, and wasn't a metal band, was known for chiming. I've still been listening to a lot of Alice Coltrane. The Carnegie Hall show is fabulous. And also started to explore Pharoah Sanders. I don't know if I'm picking a representative one, but he recorded an album with a band called Floating Points in the London Symphony Orchestra called Promises, which is strange and beautiful and meandering and would sometimes seem pointless if you didn't know that a genius was behind it. I've been listening to more Joanna Newsom. I was playing when my son Isaac walked in, and I said, "What do you think of this music?" And he said, "She's got a weird voice." And I said, yeah, she does. And she does. But it's beautiful. It's like if you sort of took all the fairy mysticism that Led Zeppelin just hinted at and just tore away all the balls, she writes some pretty amazing music that's sort of strange and sprinkled with pixie dust, which I can't even believe I'd say I'd want to listen to, but somehow she does it for me. I think she's got this sort of that whole fairy dust mystical medieval thing going on, but there's some sort of edge in there to her, and just the subject she writes about are just crazy interesting to me and brilliant. Did I mention Wake the Dead by Chuck Prophet? Chuck Prophet's a guy whose music I'll never love. My kids would say he's mid, I guess. I'd say he's high mid, but I always enjoy him. I'm just never going to feel passionate about him. But Wake the Dead is a great song. He's playing with a Southern California cumbia band called Quien Sabe, who I don't know, and they've got like 530 followers on Spotify, but it's a pretty cool tune with a sort of cumbia feel to it. I've been listening to Lola versus Power Man a lot lately too. My brother Rob's, one of his favorite songs he turned me on to was 8 Man. It's on that record, as is Power Man. Just a brilliant record. The last thing I heard that I want to talk about is Joe Walsh's Life of Illusion from his, I think it was a smash, There Goes the Neighborhood. I love that one. It's like mid, like Chuck Prophet, but such a damn good song. Like I never feel passionate about it, but it's just so fun to hear it. I listened to it twice. Anyway, that's what I got.
Hey, everybody. First and foremost, I'm so happy that everybody dug Cure for Pain as much as I hoped that they would. I'm going to blaze through my picks because it's been a light month, and plus there's something else I want to talk about. Lydia Lovelace went ahead and revisited the songs of Somewhere Else from came out in 2014. My number 2 album that year, my favorite Lydia album. She recently went ahead and re-recorded all the songs, just piano and voice. And it's a great example of an album I already loved, but now I love in a different way, because these new arrangements, these new performances just bring a depth of flavor, if you will. Digging the crap out of Jack White's No Name, X's Smoke in Fiction. This is how you go out if you're going to go out. Justin Townes Earl, a brand new odds and sods collection called All In. It's just a bunch of odds and ends from his New West years. So, but what I really want to talk to you about is my all-time favorite TV show is finally available to stream. And just for years, I would tell anybody who would listen how much I love Homicide: Life on the Street, but I could never get anybody on board because it wasn't streaming anywhere. And this was a show that I will fight you on this. This was a show that ushered in the era of peak TV. It lasted 7 seasons on NBC in the 90s with low ratings, but universally critical acclaim. I often joke it's the only cop show that matters. Every episode is like a gritty indie film. You'll watch it and you'll go, oh my God, when you see all the guest stars, just people who are now huge, just top-notch direction, just great music used in it. As a matter of fact, the latest episode of Debts No Honest Man Can Pay, I spend the lion's share talking about the show and playing a lot of the music that was featured on it. And it was securing the rights for the music that was the reason for the delay in having the show being available to stream. It's available now on Peacock. I highly recommend it. Watch it, thank me later, and then come and talk to me about it. And just don't at me about, well, what about The Sopranos? What about Breaking Bad? What about The Wire? I love all of those shows. But Homicide is what got me passionate about TV. And if you're going to bring up The Wire, there would be no Wire without Homicide, because Homicide was based on a book by David Simon, who created The Wire. And that's all I got, peeps.
I almost forgot to mention that there's a folk pop group out of North Carolina that I've been following pretty much since they started about 12 years ago. And they just dropped a really great new album called Little Deaths. I think the lead singer sounds a little bit like Chris Martin of Coldplay. His name is David Wimbish. And the last couple albums have really dealt with mental health and self-care. Anyway, their touring band is breaking up. He's kept this band together. A couple albums ago, they went crazy on streaming to where they're getting millions and millions of streams, but they haven't developed like a coherent fan base. So they're playing The End at Elliston Place, this tiny little dive across from Exit Inn tomorrow. And apparently this will be the last tour of them as the collection. But their album is called Little Deaths, that just dropped last maybe 2 Fridays ago. Anybody else, any last thoughts on television shows to watch, or anything you want to round out, respond to any of your colleagues' recommendations, anything of that nature?
I have one final thought about Morphine that didn't really fit in my talk about it. I mentioned the band to one of my friends. I had a hunch that he might have heard of it before, and he said that his favorite album from Morphine is Like Swimming, and he instructed me to enjoy it while taking a candlelit shower.
That's my least favorite Morphine record. But
you've never taken a candlelit shower while.
Oh, I haven't.
You got to get on that and get back.
I maybe need to give it another shot, and because it's been a long time since I've listened, I would say like the worst Morphine album is still better than like the best by so many other bands. One last fun fact about Homicide. For all you fans of Law and Order SVU, the character of Detective John Munch was originally a character on Homicide.
He's a great character.
Yep.
Like such a great character, they just kept moving him around.
Oh God, yeah. He's like been on like 20 shows.
Yeah. Believes in aliens, doesn't he?
I think so.
Passed. Right?
Yeah, he passed.
He was
earlier both him and Andre Brower passed. You know, pour one out for both of them. Just tremendous. I'm like, I don't think anybody would have ever bet on Belzer being a dramatic actor, but it was Barry Levinson heard Belzer on the Stern Show and said, "That's it. He's Munch."
He was good.
Well, I'm always looking for new shows to stream, so thank you for the rec. And yes, book recs. Joe, had you heard of that Willie Vlaughton?
Yeah. No, I love Richmond Fontaine, and I've read most of his books, which are heavy. There's no light. There's very little to no light in his music, but he's so good at what he does. Yeah.
Well, I started reading the new novel on the recommendation from somebody else in one of the music groups, and it's potent stuff. And the music. Yeah. I started to listen to the album that they said it was the best album from like 2004 or something, and really interesting stuff. I haven't gotten to that Justin Townes Earl yet, Scott. I just haven't had time, but I look forward to listening to it.
It's don't rush, because it's a compilation. It'll always be here. It's not like maybe it's unfair of me, but I have two groups of albums. There's like compilations and like studio albums. To me, studio albums I always tend to place more importance on them.
When somebody has passed away too soon from fentanyl, though, I'll take a compilation any day, and I'll definitely get around to that. He's truly missed.
Yep.
All right, y'all stay on the device here so we can talk about next month. We'll get next month scheduled. We do this for 1 hour once a month. It is the Music Nerds Record Club. Thanks for coming to Music Nerds Record Club 8. We'll be back at some point in September with another album and another roundup of our recent listens. Thanks to all my co-hosts, and we will see you all next month.
Bye now.
Have fun storming the castle.